Maybe everything really does come down to remembering whose we are. And from there, we figure out what we're supposed to do in this life. There was this movie came out in the year 2000. It's haunted my memory ever since watching it. The movie was called Memento. It was an early movie directed by Christopher Nolan before he got famous for Batman movies and Dunkirk and Inception and things like that. The story introduces us to this main character who pretty early on in the movie we discover is covered with tattoos, but not like, mementos of places he's been or, girlfriends past, with like facts about his life story tattooed onto his arms and onto his chest and all over. We find out early on in the movie this character has a diagnosis of some kind of short-term amnesia where he can't make new memories. He can remember things from his distant past but can't make new memories, to the point where if he meets a stranger and they introduce themselves, he's got about 30 seconds before his brain goes blank and he can't remember who they are, if he's ever met them before, or whether they are to be trusted or not. So the premise of the movie is that this character has learned that he has to record certain vital things about who he is and what he's supposed to do. In the movie, all the tattoos tell him that he is supposed to track down the killer of his wife, and there's all the clues he has gained along the way now inscribed in his arms. You should look for this sort of person. Here's his name. Here's what I know, so that he can't forget, so that he won't lose them. So over and over and over again in this movie, we're introduced to this character who will remind himself who he is by looking at the words written on his very body. Now, of course, the point here is what a pitiable situation that would be if you constantly needed reminders, not just of how to function in the world, but who you were. If you had a clear mission you were supposed to accomplish, something you were supposed to get done, and you couldn't remember it for very long, and certainly couldn't remember the details of how you do it, that would be petrifying, right? How sad it would be, how comically absurd, how tragic it would be if you couldn't remember who you were or what you were supposed to do, so that you had to keep looking at the tattoos you had inscribed on your own arms and chest and body all about it. There's something about that scene that is so absurd, but also so sad, so tragic, that the writer James has in mind when he talks about what it is to be the people of God. We church folk are great for reading our Bibles and hearing the stories. We sing the scriptures in songs. We chant them in psalms. We pray and with echoes of scripture verses. And then we read the Bible in our worship life, in Bible studies, in Sunday school, at home, in devotional life. And the writer of the book we call James says to this early Christian community, he says, it's fine if you read the Word. That's good, but don't just let it be words on a page. Go do what those words say. And how sad it is, how preposterous, how foolish, how tragic it is if we become the kind of people who read the words from God's scriptures, read God's message, and then forget how to live it. Don't bother embodying it. James goes on to say, it's better to be doers of the word, not just hearers or readers or lookers at it. And if all we ever are is just people who read words from the Bible without making a difference in how we live, it's as foolish as if you look in the mirror and then immediately forget what you look like and have to keep going back again and again and again to find out in the mirror what you look like. Who are you? In a really important sense, the followers of Jesus, the community of God's people, are called to be people who are so deep down ingrained with who we are that we don't have to keep checking it over and over and over again. In other words, James seems to be saying, you'll know who the people of God are in the world, not because they are constantly trotting out their Bibles and smacking other people in the head with them or using their Bibles as weapons, or people who live a certain way, because it's internalized in them. They don't have to even look at tattoos on their bodies to remember how God intends for them to live or who they are. It's so much a part of them on the inside that they embody it, they live it just effortlessly. It's really easy to take this New Testament book that we call the letter of James and just ream it. Famously, our older brother in the faith, Martin Luther, didn't care for it at all, because James later on will talk about the importance of good works as part of how you live out your faith. And Luther couldn't help but hear that as James must be saying, I have to do enough good deeds to make God love me. Not James' point. James is actually saying the opposite. Is actually, let's put the horse and the cart in the right order. You are a child of God. You are a part of God's people, and because of that, that's not up for debate. That's not negotiable. That's not something you can lose. Because of that, live out of that. Live because of knowing you are a child of God. So yeah, you don't have to keep going back to the Bible to find, another commandment I forgot about. You just live it because it's in you, because it's flowing out of you. If we're constantly checking our notes, whether written in our Bibles or in our journals or written on tattoos all over us, that we don't know, I'm supposed to love my neighbor. I'm supposed to look out for people who are on the margins. I'm supposed to be mindful about not being overcome by anger and meanness and rottenness. If we keep forgetting that, man, how foolish, how pitiable we are. James wants us to be free from constantly having to check our notes to remember who we are or what we're called to be in the world. And James says you don't have to have it all tattooed on you. You don't have to be constantly sitting in a church building hearing somebody else tell you, reflect the love of God and the goodness of God in the world. You get it. Now live it. Now be it. You're meant to be free to go live that way in the world. And then James sort of sketches out in the first chapter of the book we call James, he sketches out what it looks like. It's being people who don't just lash out in anger when they're upset about things, who have ways of channeling that energy, certainly, that passion, certainly, but don't just let it spill out in just sort of wrathfulness and meanness and spite. In a culture and a time like ours, my goodness, that's radically necessary good news. James says, you want to know what kind of religion God really cares about? There's not a long list of 400 commandments to worry about. How about this? Take care of people who are vulnerable. Widows and orphans are the people who come to mind in James's day. And don't let yourself get corrupted and complicit by the rottenness in the world. We're going to live in that world, but always as this presence of difference, as this presence of goodness, of decency, of justice, and of mercy. We do that not because we're trying to earn something from God, but because we are so convinced deep down in our bones we are beloved, we are God's children. And when you know that deep down, you don't have to keep writing it on your arms in a tattoo or impressing people by how often you're in a church building. Yeah, it's good for us to gather. And yes, we need to have times where one voice or another, the preacher or the choir director or the Sunday school teacher or simply the person sitting next to you, helps you to remember what it looks like to be the people of God. But sometimes we forget that the work of the church doesn't end when the last hymn is done and we walk out to the church parking lot. That's when things begin. When we gather together week by week, that's like the moment of the guy in the movie looking at the tattoos to remember his story. It's like looking in the mirror to remember who we are. And once you're clear on that again, once it's clear, yeah, that's right, I'm a child of God. And how does God act in the world? How does God's love operate in the world? What will that look like for me? How will I look out for the people most in need, most vulnerable, and put their needs before my own convenience or comfort? What might that mean for how I interact with people in the world? What small gestures I might make, whether it's a piece of fabric on your face and a mask so it keeps somebody else from getting sick or getting vaccinated, or letting somebody else go in line in front of you in the store, or looking for ways to reach out to people who are just struggling these days, veterans who are dealing with the situation in Afghanistan, or for that matter, people from Afghanistan who are seeking refuge here in this country, people who are displaced by natural disasters in Haiti. There's all these ways we can be looking out for people around us who are on the margins, that are, in James's words, the widow and the orphan, those who don't have other people looking out for them as their safety net. That's what James says is our calling. That's who we're called to be, because that's who God is. God is always the one looking out for the people on the margins. And the clearer we are in who God is, then we get a clearer picture of who we're called to be in the world. It really does all come down to remembering whose we are. And then we can stop play acting and pretending and checking our crib notes or our scripts, whether they're tattooed onto us or in our Bibles. We can simply live the new identity we have as the people of God. Join us this Sunday for that kind of conversation, so that we can then go out into the world living as the people God has called us to be, the people who belong to the God we know in Jesus. See you Sunday.